What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the CUPPS Analytics YouTube channel. My name is Alex CUPPS, and in this video, I'm going to be giving you my key fantasy takeaways from Week 4 of the 2025 NFL season. Week 4 was wild. Fantasy breakouts for a bunch of the big name rookies that we had this offseason, huge names going for massive fantasy weeks, and a couple brutal injuries that are going to shake up the fantasy landscape over the rest of the season. In last week's video, I went over every single player on every single team and went over their fantasy performance in the given week and also their expected fantasy performance on a week-by-week basis over the first 3 weeks of the year. That video was over 90 minutes long, and I talked about over 100 players, and it was a lot more than I was really hoping to dive into in these weekly videos. So this week, I decided to change up the format for these videos. I'm going to make it a little quicker, and I'm going to be talking about 3 specific charts that you can use to take away the biggest fantasy insights in the current week. The first chart that we're going to look at is a breakdown of the top 24 players at each position, running back, wide receiver, and tight end, looking at their expected fantasy points per game based on their usage, along with their actual fantasy points per game, so the actual output that they have over the first 4 weeks of the year. This chart is super insightful because it shows us who is playing the most fantasy-friendly roles currently in the NFL. Whether or not they're actually performing to that level is something that we see on this chart when we compare their actual fantasy production, but it's a good indicator of whether or not this player is due to regress towards the mean, whether that's positively or negatively. The second chart we're going to be looking at is a breakdown of the top 10 overperformers and the top 10 underperformers at each position, given their actual positional ranking and their expected positional ranking based by usage. This chart leverages a lot of the same data that we see in the first chart, except it breaks it down in a different way by looking at the positional ranking of the player and allowing us to see the players that have the biggest deltas between their actual and expected positional rankings. And finally, we're going to finish it off by going back to the draft board, looking at underdog ADP from this past offseason and looking at positional rankings there, comparing those preseason positional rankings to how these players have actually been doing so far, looking at their actual position ranking through 4 weeks of the NFL season. By looking at these 3 charts together, we can get a clear picture of the current fantasy landscape. The best buy candidates, the best sell candidates, the players that are most likely to regress, and the players that are most likely to bounce back, along with the biggest winners and losers so far this season based on where we drafted them in the past summer. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. So getting started here, we're looking at the top 24 running backs by expected fantasy points per game through the first 4 weeks of the year. The blue bars represent the expected fantasy point per game values for each of the top 24 players. You can see that the x-axis shows that we're going up to a little bit above 25 fantasy points per game expected for these players. And that is because Christian McCaffrey, in a league of his own, averaging 24 real fantasy points per game, expected for 27 fantasy points per game. So you can see he is underperforming his expectation by 3 PPR points right there. No one else within a league of Christian McCaffrey here. He is by far the most likely player to be a league winner this year if he can stay healthy. After a massive Sunday night football performance, you can see Josh Jacobs has jumped into the RB2 overall in expected fantasy points per game through the first 4 weeks. So he's expected for 19.4 in those weeks, and he's averaging 18.1. So he's underperforming by a little bit, but nothing too crazy. Definitely could have even had a bigger game last night. Got vultured a couple times with some false starts and a couple Romeo Doubs red zone touchdowns. So pretty unfortunate for Josh Jacobs managers. Still never going to complain about getting over 30 PPR points in a game though. Definitely someone that I'm stoked to lock into my lineup as an RB1 going forward. We have quite a few different running backs kind of falling between that 19 to 17 point per game expected range here, and a couple that I wanted to highlight specifically. So first off, Jonathan Taylor, he's expected for 18.9, and he is actually getting 22.4 so far through the first 4 weeks. And someone that, I think he on paper would be due to regress a little bit, but at the same time, if you're watching the games, there's been quite a bit that seems like it hasn't gone JT's way. He could have had a massive touchdown this weekend that got called back due to holding, and he's had quite a few touchdowns already too that Danny Dimes has pushed in from the 1 yard line. So honestly, I mean, I think he might be a little bit of a fake regression candidate. I think Jonathan Taylor is someone that I'm still super interested in holding on to, and I would also be interested in buying. So not really looking to sell Jonathan Taylor currently. Another player that I wanted to highlight was Javonte Williams, who is currently the RB5 in expected fantasy points per game with 18.3. So he's overperforming that by about 1.3 points with 19.6 so far actual PPR points on the year. So not really someone I'm looking to buy or sell. I'm just holding on to him if I have him. He really has looked like a different running back so far this year and an absolute steal if you got him in the later rounds of drafts this summer. So solid RB1 going forward as long as he can hold on to this Dallas RB1 spot and they don't allow Miles Sanders or Jaden Blue to start eating into his workload that much. He's going to be a locked and loaded top 5 RB going forward. Couple of the bigger overperformers so far would be Bijan, James Cook, Achane, and Irving. So especially Bijan and James Cook, where we have Bijan overperforming his expected fantasy points by 3.87. So he's expected for 18.23 and currently averaging 22.1 fantasy points per game. Similar story with James Cook, who is expected for 17.7 fantasy points per game, but is averaging almost 23 fantasy points. So both of these guys are some serious overperformers, but neither of them do I think are huge sells at the current moment. I mean, James Cook is in arguably the best offense in the NFL and seems to find his way into the end zone every week. And it seems like they also are so happy to give him every carry in this backfield, where last year you had Ray Davis and Ty Johnson eating into much more of his workload than you do this year. So I think James Cook, he's also looked like an awesome running back, where there were some questions about his talent in the past, but I think he's gone out there and proven that he is an elite running back at this time in his career. So I think I'm pretty interested in holding on to Bijan. Obviously, we know he is also an elite running back, maybe the best in the NFL. Bijan, James Cook, looking to hold on to both those guys. Achane and Irving, on the other hand, I think there's a case to be made to sell both of them, particularly Achane, who's overperforming his expectation by over 3 PPR points currently. He's expected for 16.5 and currently has 19.6 PPR points per game. And I think with Achane, he's just in such a terrible offense, and a lot of the upside simply runs through the fact that this offense is so terrible. If the offense did get better and the passing game started to perform more effectively with Tyreek and Waddle, then Achane would suffer a little bit. He's always going to have a floor on this team, getting all the dump-offs from Tua, given their poor offensive line and how much he serves as a receiver for them. But I just think with how poor the offense as a whole has been for the Dolphins, I'd probably be looking to get off Achane for that RB1 price tag. You can see we also have a couple of the 2025 rookie running backs on this list as well, with Cam Scatterbo, Quinshon Judkins, Omarion Hampton, and Ashton Jeanty. Scatterbo averaging 13 fantasy points currently and is expected for 15.5, so he's been underperforming his expectation a little bit. That number is also buoyed a little bit by his lower usage in the earlier weeks with Tyrone Tracy active. So I'd expect him to skyrocket up this list as the weeks continue to come on this season. He's looked awesome, and he's playing an absolute bell cow role for the New York Giants. So definitely interested to see how this offense looks with no Malik Neighbors and Jackson Dart taking the helm at QB. I believe it could be really running through Dart and Cam Scatterbo for the rest of this season. Quinshon Judkins has looked like an absolute dog since he took over that backfield in Cleveland the past 2 weeks as well. He has been insane back there, pretty much just taking every single carry immediately after coming back from the investigation. So he is now averaging 16 actual fantasy points per game, expected for 14.9. So overperforming by a little bit, over a point. Super stoked to have Quinshon Judkins from late in the drafts this summer. He's looking like he's going to be a smash the rest of the way. Then we have Hampton and Jeanty, two of the more coveted running backs from this 2025 class. Both got off to a little bit of a slow start this year, but have been absolutely going off the past couple weeks. Hampton, after Najee went down, has seen a majority of the workload in the backfield for the Chargers, and he's doing the most with it. He's averaging 16 fantasy points now, average expected fantasy points of 13.98. So overperforming a little bit. Same thing with Jeanty, who is now averaging 15.4 fantasy points on the year. He is expected for 12.9, so overperforming a little bit as well. but not something I'm worried about with Ginty. I think he's shown what he's capable of in this previous game where he went for 140 something yards, 33 and a half fantasy points, and a couple breakaway runs, getting more involved in the receiving game as well. So super excited for Ashton Ginty. For those of you who follow my model and the predictive modeling I did for the 2025 rookies, you'll know that Ashton Ginty actually came out as the #1 fantasy running back in terms of projected fantasy points per game of any running back in my database since 2014. So he's ahead of Christian McCaffrey, Bijan Robinson, Saquon Barkley, all those guys. So high hopes for Ashton Ginty. We saw a sneak peek of what I would hope we will continue to see going forward this previous week. Next, we'll dive into the top 24 wide receivers by expected fantasy points per game through week 4. Starting off at the top with Puka Nacua, who is also in a league of his own in terms of expected fantasy points per game and actual fantasy points per game so far this year. So Puka, 20.88 expected fantasy points per game. He is the only wide receiver above that 20-point threshold and averaging 27.4 actual fantasy points per game. So Puka is off to a legendary start to this year. I think if you do a redraft right now, he's either the 101 or 102, depending on whether or not you want C-Mac over him. But yeah, definitely wide receiver 1 rest of the way. A couple other interesting names at the top that I want to call out here. Chris Olave comes in as the wide receiver 2 in expected fantasy points per game, which is insane. He's averaging only 12.6 actual fantasy points, but 18.58 expected fantasy points. So he's underperforming his expectation by about 6 fantasy points per game right now. Only real question mark with Chris Olave is obviously this Saints offense and whether or not they can get something clicking and score more points as a whole. Because right now I think he's kind of propped up by an unsustainable passing rate in this offense. That's why his fantasy points per game expected are so high at 18.58 because this team passes the ball a million times a game. So I think in order for this to come to fruition, we would really need to see a better quarterback step in or the offensive scheme just start to click. We're also seeing Chris Godwin, first game back, coming right back as the wide receiver 4 in expected fantasy points per game. Obviously small sample size and only puts up 5.6 real points this week, but expected for 17.9. So looks like he's right back into that alpha role in Tampa Bay that we saw last year before his injury. Some other big underperformers that we're seeing would be Drake London, Tedero McMillan, and Mike Evans. So all 3 of these guys underperforming their expectation by at least 1 or 2 PPR points per game. Someone like Tedero McMillan, I think he is one of the better buys in all of fantasy right now. He hasn't found the end zone yet, but he is playing a dominant wide receiver 1 role in that Carolina offense. So I'm definitely looking to buy Tedero McMillan in pretty much any league that I can that I don't already have him, because I think we could see a very bright path the rest of the way this year for T-Mac. Scrolling down a little further, you can see we have Brian Thomas Jr. coming in as the wide receiver 19 in expected fantasy points per game, underperforming this by more than any wide receiver on the list not named Chris Godwin. So 9 fantasy points actual for Brian Thomas Jr. through 4 games, 14.1 expected fantasy points. So one of the bigger underperformers and a lot of question marks in terms of whether or not this is a connection with Trevor Lawrence issue. Is this a coaching staff issue in terms of the plays they're asking him to run? So yeah, not really sure what I'd be doing with Brian Thomas right now. I'd definitely be more inclined to send out some offers to buy him than to sell, but just not a great situation overall from what we're seeing down in Jacksonville. Jumping into the top 24 tight ends by expected fantasy points per game, it's been quite an interesting year to say the least at the tight end position so far. Jake Ferguson leads the way with 15.6 actual fantasy points per game, just about 16 expected. So he's over 2 points per game higher in terms of expected fantasy points per game than any other tight end on this list. Some of the later round tight ends, such as, Juwan Johnson, Hunter Henry, Fannin, Pitts, Strange, all cracked the top 10 in expected fantasy points per game as well. Yeah, just a weird year so far for the tight ends. Not a ton of major underperformers. The only real overperformer would be Kincaid and Dallas Goedert. Kincaid averaging 4 fantasy points per game over his expectation, with Dallas Goedert also averaging over 5 fantasy points per game over his expectation. So if anything, those would be my 2 main takeaways from this would be those are the 2 tight ends I'd be looking to sell if I could right now. Next, let's dive into the second chart where we're going to look at the top 10 overperformers and underperformers at each position. So we'll start off with the running backs through week 4. This chart looks at the position rank delta, so the expected position rank and the actual position rank for the player, and just takes that difference between those two numbers. So for example, we can see Chase Brown at the top being the biggest underperformer through the year so far for running backs. He is the actual RB35, but the expected RB10, which gives him a delta of -25. I like to think of this chart as a summary of the best buys and sells across each position currently, with the underperformers being the best buys and the overperformers being the best sells. It isn't a perfect science, obviously, because there's plenty of names on this list that I wouldn't be interested in buying, along with plenty of names that I wouldn't be interested in selling currently. So it really just comes down to which names stick out to you in terms of which ones you think are good values right now. So I'll go over the ones that I think are the best buys and the sells from this list. Speaking of running backs that are underperforming and I don't want to buy low on, we'll start with Chase Brown, who is the RB35 currently, like I was saying, and projecting as the RB10 given his usage. I think that's kind of a fake buy low considering this offense right now. And I already wasn't a huge fan of Chase Brown's talent before. So without Joe Burrow and with this offense just kind of sputtering out this year, I think I'm happy to be out on Chase Brown or sell low on him as well, even if there's someone who still believes in the talent and wants to take a shot on him. On the other hand, you have someone like Cam Scatabo, who is the RB24 currently, but projects as the RB13. He is someone I would absolutely be interested in buying low on if I could. If I could take Chase Brown and turn him into Cam Scatabo straight up, I would do that right now. Like I was mentioning earlier, he's going to have a stranglehold on this backfield with Tyrone Tracy out, and the upside with Jackson Dart taking over at quarterback, I think, proves that Cam Scatabo could be an awesome running back down the stretch. Another name I'd be interested in buying low on is definitely Josh Jacobs, though it might be pretty difficult to buy low on the guy who just put up 30-something points on Sunday Night Football. But if you can find someone who's just looking at positional rankings and sees that they have the RB9 currently, I would definitely be interested in sending out an offer for Jacobs, considering he is the expected RB2 right now. Two other names that stick out to me here would be Saquon and Jaylen Warren. Obviously, two very different talent profiles, but if you see someone in your league that's a Saquon manager, drafted the guy RB1, 2, or 3 in this past offseason, sees that he's RB13 and doesn't like watching the Eagles offense, I would definitely be interested in trying to buy low on Saquon, who is currently the RB6 in expected fantasy points. Similar story with Jaylen Warren, who's been sneaky under the radar this year. He's currently the RB16, but projects as the RB9 on the year given his usage. So he's someone who in the Steelers offense is getting a majority of the carries. He's getting a lot of the receiving work out of the backfield. As long as Caleb Johnson remains a non-factor in this backfield, I think Jaylen Warren's going to be an every week starter for you. So if you can get a good deal on Jaylen Warren, if someone values him as a mid RB2, you can get yourself a back end RB1 for cheap. So there's definitely some running backs on this overperformers list that I would be interested in exploring offers for if I had them on my team. We can start with James Cook here, with him being the RB2 in actual fantasy and the RB8 in expected fantasy points per game. So a delta of 6 between his expected and actual position rankings. Not a player that I'm interested in getting off my team by any means possible. Like I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of upside with James Cook currently with the offense he's in. But if I could turn him into one of those top tier running backs like Christian McCaffrey, Jahmyr Gibbs, Bijan Robinson, I would definitely be interested in looking to do that. A couple other big names would be Kenneth Walker and J.K. Dobbins. Kenneth Walker is currently the RB19, but the expected RB27. J.K. Dobbins currently the RB15, but the expected RB26. With Kenneth Walker, it just seems like no matter how much better he looks than Zach Charbonnet, it seems like the Seattle coaching staff is insistent on getting Zach Charbonnet his fair share of carries every game. So we saw this week on Thursday Night Football with Kenneth Walker getting vultured by Zach Charbonnet almost twice on the goal line if it weren't for a holding penalty on JSN. So it seems like not only do they like Charbonnet, but they're super happy to use him in the red zone as well. With that being said, I think Kenneth Walker is definitely someone that I would be interested in selling if I could get the value for him. J.K. Dobbins as well, the RB15 in actual fantasy points per game, RB26 expected. He's been running hot on touchdowns recently, and I really just don't see him holding on to this stranglehold in the Broncos backfield the whole year. With RJ Harvey getting drafted in the second round this past draft, I think RJ Harvey's going to eventually take on his fair share of a workload in the backfield and potentially take over the backfield as the workhorse down the stretch when it matters most. In terms of overperformers that I wouldn't be looking to sell, one would definitely be Woody Marks, who is the current RB32, but the expected RB47. And I would pretty much disregard everything for Woody Marks up to this point this year, other than this past week where he exploded for something like 30 PPR points, a couple touchdowns. He was splitting carries with Nick Chubb in the backfield. I think Woody Marks is someone that could continue to gain some traction in the Texans offense as the year goes on, and someone I'd definitely be actually looking to buy if I could right now. Getting into the top overperforming and underperforming wide receivers, we could start with Chris Olave at the top. Talked about him earlier. He's currently the wide receiver 29, but the expected wide receiver 2. Already dove into his situation a little bit earlier, so I won't talk about that much here. Other than Chris Olave, the two biggest underperformers at the wide receiver position would be Jacoby Myers and Drake London. Jacoby Myers, the current wide receiver 35, expected wide receiver 18. Drake London, the current wide receiver 22, expected wide receiver 11. These are both guys I would definitely be interested in buying low on, especially Drake London, who I still believe has top 5 upside at the position going forward. Definitely some major opportunities in terms of selling wide receiver overperformers so far through the first 4 weeks. I would pretty much sell every wide receiver in this overperformer list other than Emeka Egbuka. I think Emeka Egbuka is continuing to ascend in that Tampa Bay offense, but other than him, Pittman, Waddle, Dobbs, Reed, Thornton, Debo, Tucker, Shakir, Metcalf, all of them are heavily outperforming their expectation. And if I could move any of these guys and try to get into some of the underperforming guys that we see here, obviously it's going to be hard to get into like, a CD or a J. Jeff, but someone like a Marv or Devontae, these guys I would definitely be interested in trying to work a deal if I had any of these overperformers on this list. Looking at the top 10 overperforming and underperforming tight ends, we see some of the same patterns that we were seeing for running backs and wide receivers. At the top of the list, we have Harold Fannin coming in at tight end 20, underperforming his expectation as the tight end 7 by 13 position ranks. So I would definitely be interested in sending out offers for Harold Fannin if I could. I was high on him as a prospect. He exploded in week 1 and then has kind of come back down to earth a little bit over the past couple weeks. But I still view him as a mid to low end tight end 1 the rest of the way. The usage is there, but the production just hasn't matched it yet. So I would definitely be sending out some offers for him for the cheap if I could right now. Another tight end I'd definitely be interested in buying low on would be TJ Hawkinson, who's currently the tight end 21 and the expected tight end 13, so a difference of 8 there. He's started slow this year, but I think TJ Hawkinson, still a talented tight end, and if anyone's frustrated with the production so far throughout the year and you could buy him low right now, I would definitely be interested in doing so as well. Same thing goes for Juwan Johnson, who's currently the tight end 9, but expected as the tight end 4. He shares a lot of the same traits as Chris Olave with this Saints passing offense, just passing the ball so many times right now. He's just going to get fed every week, and that's pretty much all we can ask for from a tight end. If we could buy him for the cheap, I would definitely be interested in doing that as well. There's a bunch of random names here on the overperformers for the tight ends, but kind of what I alluded to earlier, I think the biggest sells at the tight end position in terms of the ones that are overperforming would be Dalton Kincaid and Dallas Goedert, who I went into a little bit earlier, so I won't go into them too much more here. So the third and final chart that we will look at tonight is the ADP versus actual position rank through the first 4 weeks. So we have 3 columns here. The first column being the player name, the second column being the ADP positional rank, and this ADP comes from Underdog Fantasy from paid drafts this past offseason between April and August. So you can see, for example, Bijan Robinson was selected as the RB1 on average over that time frame, Jahmyr Gibbs the RB2, and so on. And then the third column is their actual fantasy point per game rank so far this year. So red would indicate that they are underperforming their ADP positional rank, and green would indicate that they are overperforming. So this basically just gives us a macro level view of the biggest winners and losers so far, the best picks you could have made at each position from this past draft season. One important thing to note is that this only shows the top 24 at each position, so it doesn't go any deeper than the top 24. You're not going to get any of those late round hits that have exploded this year so far. This is pretty much just looking at those early round picks at each position and which ones have panned out the best and the worst so far. So not surprisingly, the running backs that have been the biggest difference makers, Christian McCaffrey, Jonathan Taylor, James Cook, you were stoked if you were able to pick up JT at RB10, James Cook at RB14, even Christian McCaffrey at RB4 was great value. You're also not too upset if you got Bijan or Jahmyr Gibbs at the top of the first round either. Both of them have been performing pretty much on expectation. Some of the bigger busts would be some of the names we talked about earlier. Saquon, drafted as the RB3, current RB13. Derrick Henry, drafted as the RB5, current RB20. I think the most impactful bust, though, so far would definitely have to be Chase Brown, who was drafted as the RB8 and is currently the RB35 in fantasy points per game. Other names to make note of would be Travion Henderson, drafted as the RB15, current RB34. RJ Harvey, drafted as the RB21, current RB57. Not as worried about these guys, though. Rookies tend to come on later down the stretch, so I would hope to see these guys bounce back in the coming games. Moving over to the wide receiver position, you can see a lot of red here. It's been a tough year for the early wide receiver drafters. Jamar Chase, wide receiver 1, current wide receiver 10. Justin Jefferson, current wide receiver 17 after being drafted as the wide receiver 3. Nico Collins, wide receiver 4, current wide receiver 23. Malik Neighbors, rest in peace, drafted as the wide receiver 5, current wide receiver 21. So pretty much unless you drafted Amon-Ra or Puka, you are in trouble in terms of the early wide receiver crowd. We also have this big clump of those round 2 wide receivers here that have been pretty brutal so far this year. BTJ, wide receiver 8, wide receiver 51. AJ Brown, wide receiver 10, wide receiver 54. Ladd McConkey, same thing, drafted as the wide receiver 11, current wide receiver 60. T. Higgins, wide receiver 12, current wide receiver 66. So tough year to be drafting wide receivers in the second round as well, unless you picked the one correct answer, which seemed to be Jackson Smith-Njigba, who was drafted as the wide receiver 14 and is currently the wide receiver 8. Other than that, not so great from the second round, third round wide receivers. Scrolling down here, I wanted to highlight some of the best clicks that you could have made at wide receiver this past offseason. So George Pickens, drafted as the wide receiver 22, is the current wide receiver 6. Who knows if that would be the case if CeeDee Lamb was healthy, but regardless, that's what he is currently. We also have down here at the very bottom, I did expand it to the top 36 wide receivers since there were more relevant ones drafted here. Rome Odunze, drafted as the wide receiver 36, is the current wide receiver 3. So I think it's probably fair to say that the most impactful wide receiver selection that you could have made in the earliest rounds of your draft would have been Rome Odunze. Finishing off with the tight end position here, we can see that it's a similar pattern to what we saw with the wide receivers. Pretty brutal year to go early tight end. Brock Bowers, tight end 1, was drafted as the tight end 1 and is currently the tight end 12. Trey McBride, one of the lone bright spots in terms of the early tight ends, drafted as the tight end 2, is currently the tight end 4. George Kittle, drafted as the tight end 3, currently the tight end 7 in points per game, but he's hurt. Laporta, brutal, drafted as the tight end 4, is currently the tight end 19. Tyler Warren, drafted as tight end 5, currently the tight end 5. So another one of those great picks that you could have made. So Trey McBride, Tyler Warren, those are pretty much the only 2 bright spots in the top 10, other than Tucker Kraft at tight end 10 in terms of ADP. He's currently the tight end 6. But we only have 5 of the top 12 ADP tight ends are currently in the top 12 at the position through 4 weeks. So not great to see from the tight ends. Hoping to see some of them bounce back in the coming weeks. But yeah, shockingly, some of the most valuable tight ends so far this year were coming in the later rounds, with players like Dalton Kincaid, currently the tight end 8, drafted as the tight end 13. Ferguson, drafted as the tight end 14, currently the tight end 1. Dallas Goedert, drafted as the tight end 16, currently the tight end 2. Hunter Henry, drafted as the tight end 18, currently the tight end 3. So seeing a pattern there of the later round tight ends, definitely the ones that you wanted to target this year if everything holds as it is right now going forward. That is a wrap on the Week 4 CUPPS Analytics Fantasy Report. Thanks for watching, and let me know what you thought of this new style of video. Tried to trim it down a little bit, make it a little more digestible than the previous week. So I still will be doing those game-by-game breakdowns of every fantasy relevant player on my Twitter. So if you're interested in that, you can go check out my Twitter at CUPPS Analytics. I'll put the link to that in the description of this video. So that's all I have for you guys this week. Looking forward to making one of these every week. And let me know if there's anything you'd like to see different. But that's all I got for you right now. Thanks for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, and I will see you next time.